Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Yes, and I promise to try and speak slowly. And I want to say thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this wonderful country. Thank you to the Minister for all your hospitality, and of course to Hala, who's been a wonderful host, even if she has worked me to death in the last 2 days. I want to say how wonderful it is to be outside of the United States of America during an election year, so I can get away from the insanity of American politics. So what I'm going to do today is to walk you through the world that we now live in. A world that many of you are unfamiliar with by virtue of your age or your gender. If you're a woman, the chances are you're not that familiar with pornography. And if you're a man over the age of 40, the chances are that you don't really know what the new industry is about. I'm also going to take you through the world of young people and explain the kind of pornified society in which they grow up. And I'm going to do that as a way to explore how are we going to deal with the fact that in the United States of America now we have a small group of men, the pornographers, who determine the sex education of the rest of the world. And the question I'm going to ask you is, do you in Iceland want a handful of American men in the valley in Los Angeles determining the sexuality of your boys and your girls and your men and your women? Because that's exactly what's happening now. So I'm going to begin with looking at the industry size. Now, as you can see, it is a huge industry, reckoned to be about 97 billion worldwide. We never really know exactly how much it is, but this is a kind of rough figure. Now, what I want to just show you is the way that the pornography has overtaken the internet completely. 36% of the internet is pornography. There are more than 26 million porn sites. The online porn industry makes over $3,000 a second. There are 40 million regular consumers of online porn in the USA. 1 in 4 search queries is about pornography. So this is a huge industry. The question is, how did we get here? Because if somebody would have said to me, even 10, 15 years ago, when I was doing this work, that the pornographers would take over our sexuality to this degree, that their images would be so misogynist and so violent, I would have said impossible. The culture is simply not going to allow the pornographers to march in and hijack everyone's sexuality. That's what I would have said. I would have been wrong. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to how we got here. And of course, we have to begin with Hugh Hefner. Now, people say there's always been pornography. It's true, right? I'm sure the first time a man understood he could make something in the ground with a stick, he produced pornography, okay? I don't question that. However, the porn industry did not begin till 1953, with the first edition of Playboy. And what I want us to think about is not pornography as a discourse, as a collection of images, but as an industry. And the first edition of Playboy in 1953, the winter of 1953, was the first time ever porn images circulated within the mainstream channels of American capitalism. This was the beginning of the industry. Now, he thought he was going to prison, so he didn't even put a date on the first edition. It turned out he sold out overnight. Now, the question becomes, how is it possible that in the 1950s, what was arguably one of the most conservative decades of the USA, how did a pornographic magazine sell out overnight? And the answer to that is you have to understand America post-Second World War. Europe was in shreds, bombed to bits. There was no economic power. And America understood that the future was building an economic empire rather than just bombing the shit out of any country they could lay their hands on. So what they did was, very interestingly, they had to build a consumer society which was dependent on people consuming. Now, it is impossible to think of Americans today as non-consumers. But post-Second World War, many of them were brought up during a war and a depression. They were naturally frugal people. That's what depression and wars do. And what you needed was to jumpstart the economy, which you needed people to buy products on credit. Now, the television was introduced in the 50s and went widespread as a way to make women consumers. The soap operas, all those shows were geared at women because they had some discretionary income. For the first time in America, you had a growing white middle class who were on the way up, who had discretionary income. So you had to teach women to spend. Where were you going to teach the men? And this was the brilliance of Hugh Hefner. When you look at the first editions of Playboy, you barely see any pictures of women, but there's a 6-page article on what ice bucket to buy. There's an article on what suit to buy for the upwardly mobile businessman. Articles on what furniture to buy for your office. They were teaching men to be consumers. Now, the real prize in pornography, and especially Playboy, the message, was if you consume to this degree, you will get what the real prize is, which is the women in the magazines, the girl next door. Now, I want to say, we think about pornography as the commodification of sexuality. You all familiar with that term? What commodification is? Commodification means you take something which is yours, like water, you then give it to a corporation who owns it, so it makes it into something, a commodity, and then sells it back to you. But it was first and foremost yours. That's what commodification means. That's what pornography does. It takes what is rightfully ours, our sexuality, robs it of us, turns it into a commodity, industrializes it, and then sells it back. So he commodified sexuality. But he also sexualized commodities, because he said to men, if you buy to this degree, you will get the girls. Now, is everyone understanding my English? Okay, good. Now, in 1953 to 1969, Hugh Hefner ran the show. He was really the only game in town. Then in 1969, in the New York Times, there was a big ad which had the bunny in the crosshairs of a rifle, the Playboy bunny. And underneath, it said, "We're going bunny hunting." And that was the ad for Penthouse. And this was the first time Bob Guccione, in 1969, came to America. And his job was to become the #1 porn magazine. And between 1969 and 1973, there was a war between Playboy and Penthouse to see who could produce the most explicit magazine. Now, let me say, Penthouse won the battle but lost the war. The reason was that Penthouse became so sexually explicit that all the advertisers ran back to Playboy. They didn't want to be associated with such a sexually explicit magazine. What was crucial about the war between 69 and 73 was it pushed the cultural envelope in the United States of America about what was acceptable pornography. And watching this in Ohio was a strip club owner named Larry Flint, who understood that 1973 was the perfect year for the first edition of Hustler. So, this is the porn industry up to the 90s. Playboy is the softcore, Penthouse is the bridge, Hustler the hardcore. When I first started, this was as bad as it got. Today, I want to tell you these are the good old days. Okay? I'm serious. These are the good old days. So what changed everything? How did everything explode late 90s, early 2000? The internet. The internet basically changed the shape of the porn industry. Now, I want to make something very clear. The technology did not necessarily facilitate the pornography. It's often the other way around. The pornographers are huge investors in research for technology. And in fact, it is much of the pornographers' money that drove internet technology today. Much of what you see as the technology on the internet actually was through pornographic research. Now, what did the internet do? It made pornography accessible, affordable, and anonymous. The three key things that drive consumer base. The more affordable, the more men can afford it. The more accessible, the more they can get hold of it. The more anonymous, the less guilt they feel. So I want you to think of the men in the room today over the age of 40. Think about when you were 13 and 14, hormones raging, You wanted to look at pornography. What did you do? You stole your father's Playboy, yes? Or you got some hold of some pornography. But you had limited access to it. And what you were looking at were naked pictures of women smiling in a cornfield with no clothes on, okay? Bad enough in its sexism, but it was still nothing like today. Now, what I want you to think about today is that 14 or 13 or 12 or 11-year-old boy does not have to steal his father's Playboy. He has access continually to pornography. Hardcore, in-your-face, cruel pornography. The sort of pornography that is mainstream today, when I first started this, you couldn't find most of it, even in a regular porn shop. You had to go to specific porn shops. And today it is mainstream. So what we have now is an experiment underway. Never before have we brought up a generation of boys on hardcore pornography. Never. I can't tell you what the long-term results are going to be. What I can tell you, as somebody who is a media scholar, is that there is no way that you can live in a pornographic culture and it not impact on the way you think about sex, sexuality, and heterosexuality. If that was the case, if pornography had no effect, then everything we know in sociology and everything we know in psychology would be wrong. We would have to say that we as human beings are born who we are and we are unaffected by the culture, which of course makes no sense to anyone who studies sociology or psychology. We're cultural beings. You learn to be who you are through the culture. And let me ask you a question. Do you all agree the fashion industry shapes the way we dress? Do you all agree the food industry shapes the way we eat? So how could it be possible that the only industry in the world that has no effect whatsoever is the porn industry? Right? And also, if images had no effect, then what are corporations doing spending billions of dollars on advertising? Because I don't know any corporation that gives money away for nothing, do you? All right, they give money away because they want something back in return. Now, I want to set the context of pornography within the pop culture, because pornography and pop culture work symbiotically. And I want you to think about the way the world has changed. Most of us in this room, and I'm going to be kind here, I'm going to say above the age of 35, okay, grew up in what we call a print-based culture, where the dominant form of communication was the printed word. Today, our kids are in an image-based culture, where the dominant form of communication is the image, no longer the printed word. But when the printed word was the dominant form of communication, we had some immunization to the seduction of the eloquence of the printed word. We could engage with the printed word rationally. I agree with that, or I don't agree with that. That makes sense, that doesn't make sense. That tells the truth, that doesn't tell the truth. Ask the same questions about the image, and it makes no sense. Does that tell the truth? What's truth or lies around the image? And I would go so far as to argue that even when images lie, they tell the truth. Because although Katy Perry looks nothing like that, and although women look nothing like that, how many women are still sitting here comparing yourselves to her? Right? So even when you know it's not telling the truth, it's still telling the truth to you in a profound way. So let's take a walk through the pop culture of American kids, and I assume much of it is for Icelandic kids as well. And notice that the core of the image is a thin, female, young, toned, sexualized, barely clothed, often fragmented into bits and pieces. So this is the standard image. Now, I want to introduce you to some media theory. So there is a concept in media theory called the reader inscribed in the text that argues that all images are produced with a viewer in mind. So look at her face. Look at her gaze, G-A-Z-E. And I want to ask you a question. Who is she speaking to? And before you answer, do you think she's speaking to her mother, saying, let's go for a cup of coffee after the photo shoot? Okay, so who's she talking to? Who's she speaking to? Men. And what's she saying? Should we put it clearly? How about fuck me? Would that be a clear enough way? Okay, so this is what I call the fuck me lock. And as women, most of us know it because we could do it, right? In my classes, I get my students to make me do it. And they shout instructions, and we all know what it looks like. Yes, something like this. Now, what I do is I then get a male student to come up and do the fuck me look. And it looks ridiculous, right? Now, the question is, why does it look ridiculous? So let's think about this. For women, the fuck me look looks right because it is a look of vulnerability. Come and get me. I'm yours. For men, it looks ridiculous because it is a look of vulnerability. And what makes male sexuality hot is not vulnerability. It's aggressiveness. So the real fuck me look for men is not fuck me. What is it? It's fuck you. Right? Now, the problem with this is that encoded into female sexuality is vulnerability, and encoded into male sexuality is aggressiveness. So I want us to begin to think of rape and violence against women not as an unfortunate byproduct of our society, but as built into the gender system. Men who rape are not deviants. They are over-conforming to media messages. Think what it must be like as a male to grow up from the word go and to have the visual representation of women saying, come get me, I'm yours. It is a way to shape. Now, it is, of course, not the only reason that men rape. There are multiple reasons. But again, I want to say, as the mother of a son, I refuse to accept that boys are born rapists, that they are born Johns, or they are born batterers. Because my son was not born any of those things. And if my son wasn't, then I bet your son wasn't. And men don't often understand this, but I want to say, feminists are your best friends. We are the only group that truly believe in your humanity. Everybody else thinks boys will be boys, and you're born a John, you're born a rapist, and there's nothing we can do about it. We as feminists, we have always refused to do that. We have always been rooting for your humanity. Because we don't believe any of those things. We do not believe what the pornographers say about you. Because the pornographers, what they say about men is not true for my son. And I'm sure it's not true for most of your sons as well. So let's think about the way in which the culture shapes men and women in a particular way. And this is a perfect example. This is Vanity Fair from last year. This was just before the Oscars. Each one of these people is up for Best Oscar, for Best Actress. What do you notice? All right? Now, let me say something. These women are at the height of their career. You don't get any better than being up for an Oscar, do you? And yet, look what they're reduced to. Even at the height of their career, they're fuck objects. There is no getting your way out of this for women. This is the reality in patriarchy for women. You are a fuck object, you are either fuckable or you are invisible. Those are your choices. And we all know that as women. Invisibility or fuckability, that's your choice. Now, let's think about this as well. Think about, in America, the first thing they do in prisons is they make you strip. The reason for that is to be unclothed in the presence of people who are clothed is to be rendered vulnerable. And I want you to think about when you go out at night and you see young women barely clothed, in very little dress, and the men fully clothed. It is the vulnerability of the women up against the power of the men to be clothed. I could stand women being barely clothed if the men too were in shorts or Speedos. I could stand that, all right? But the fact that the men are fully clothed and the women are unclothed is once again the reality of our gender system. Now, I want you to think about the world that our young girls grow up in. The world of Lindsay Lohan, Rihanna, Britney Spears, Pamela Anderson, Paris Hilton, who is the most photographed woman in the world. Now, Paris Hilton is often a punchline in a joke. But I want us to step back a minute and think about this woman. She was 18 years old when a sex tape of hers was released onto the market. It was the best-selling porn movie for 2 years. It was made by her boyfriend, who was then 11 years older than her and married. She tried to sue him to stop the sex tape. I want you to think for a minute the humiliation and the trauma of being that age and having your sex tape everywhere. And she behaved typically like a trauma victim does. Because women who have been sexually assaulted or humiliated sexually have two choices. They either stay away from men, or they then decide they're going to own their new status as a slut. And what she said was, you know what? You're going to call me a slut? I'm going to be the very best slut you've ever seen. And was she? She was. But let me say something. Paris Hilton can wear the slut label with pride because her millions act as an upmarket cleansing cream. Put the slut label on a young girl in school. Put it on a working class girl or any girl. And what studies show, it's just amazing, the new studies, that girls who get labelled sluts in schools carry with them that trauma for the rest of their lives. It upends their life. They have symptoms very similar to rape victims. They have PTSD, which shows itself in anxiety, depression, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, early pregnancy, suicidality. In fact, when you look at a girl who gets labelled a slut, she looks like a rape victim. So I would argue to be labelled a slut is a kind of collective rape of her identity. So I want you to begin to think now how we're setting our girls up for sluthood, as if this is a great thing and this is an ownership of your own sexuality. And look at her, Nicole Kidman, 40-odd years old, Oscar winner. Even she is sucked in to the representation of women like this. If an Oscar winner cannot say no, you tell me how a 15-year-old girl can. And the woman, of course, who started it all, who has no more sense at 50 than she had at 20. And then I want to talk about Miley Cyrus a bit. Do you all know her? Right, this is Miley Cyrus in Vanity Fair at 15. This is with her father at 15. Would you like to do that with your father? I certainly wouldn't. This is a year later in Elle. You see, what happened with Miley Cyrus, did you all have Hannah Montana here? Right. Miley Cyrus was Disney's Hannah Montana, a commodity worth not millions but billions. But she had a problem. She was aging out of squeaky clean Hannah Montana. They had to rebrand her into slutty Miley Cyrus, who can compete with Rihanna and Beyoncé and Lady Gaga. So what they did is they rebranded her into a more slutty image. And when I say slut, I don't think there's such a thing as a slut. I'm using that as shorthand for the way that women's sexuality is policed in our culture. But did it work? She's completely rebranded. And they knew that their commodity worth billions was not going to cut it as squeaky clean Hannah Montana. So I want us to begin to think of what young girls are up against in our culture. So you end up with like this in French Vogue. She's 9 years old. So I want to say something. For years, those of us who teach women's studies knew something was going on in the culture. Something has shifted. We didn't yet have the term pornification or hypersexualization. But those of us who taught women's studies and spoke to young women felt a change. And I remember being filmed for a documentary 5 years ago. And I remember sitting in that room with the documentary filmmaker, trying to conceptualize what was happening and not succeeding. And then the person who gave me exactly what I needed to know was not a PhD in communications, was not a scholar. It was actually an incarcerated child rapist. I like to call it Dick. Now, Dick was in prison for raping his 10-year-old stepdaughter. And he was, all of these guys, and I'm going to talk about these guys later because I interviewed them in Connecticut State Prison a few years ago. 8 of them, all of them in for raping a child, not one of them was a pedophile. All right? So you have to start thinking about this. Non-pedophile men raping children. Whole different ballgame. So he's not a pedophile, never raped a child before, in his 40s. Okay? And he's explaining to me how he groomed his stepdaughter. Now, do you all know what grooming is? Let me explain for those who don't. When a man is about to rape a child, he doesn't jump in and rape a child. What he does is he finds often a vulnerable child. He then gives her presents and gifts, tells her how beautiful she is and how sexual she is. So by the time he actually rapes her, she believes that she is a legitimate rape victim. It's called grooming. Have you all heard of what's going on in England with Jimmy Savile? Right? He was big-time English guy, the Jim will fix it guy. They are looking into now 340 cases of child rape. Right? That's a typical pedophile. Hundreds and hundreds of cases. This Dick never raped a kid before in his 40s, so he's definitely not a pedophile. Anyway, Dick says to me, he's looking at me and he's explaining the grooming process, and then he says, the culture did a lot of the grooming for me. And I almost fell off my chair because I thought, that's it. He's crystallized it. We're living in a perpetrating culture. The culture as a mass is grooming our young girls into a hypersexuality and a pornified sexuality that is not authentically theirs. Does this make sense? Right, so now you have girls being groomed by Cosmopolitan, by MTV, by the shows, into early sexuality. This is nothing authentic to them. They didn't come up with this. It's all a plasticized, generic, formulaic sexuality that looks the same. So now we begin to think of a perpetrating pop culture and how it is shifting the way young girls see themselves. It is actually reshaping female identity. And you know what? You need to do that because they are about to date men whose major form of sex education has been pornography. So let's now talk about the porn industry, because you cannot separate pop culture from the porn industry. So the first thing to think about is this is Andrew Edmond, who is a pornographer, and he was interviewed by Brandweek, and he said something very important. He said a lot of people get distracted from the business model by the sex. It is just as sophisticated and multi-layered as any other marketplace. We, meaning the pornographers, operate just like any Fortune 500 company. This is a business. This is not an erotic form of sexuality. This is not fantasy. Fantasy happens in the head. Pornography happens in the banks of international capital. Can you see the difference? Head, banks of capital, very different, okay? So I want us to think about what this Andrew Edmonds said. He said, don't get distracted by the sex. Think of it as you would think of a car business, food industry, anything else. This is the way we need to think about pornography. So porn businesses, like all businesses, raise capital, hire mergers and accountants, they undergo mergers and acquisitions, they organize trade shows, they enter into co-marketing arrangements with other companies, they create investment companies, they have PR firms, they have product placement, and very importantly, they interface with banks, credit card companies, venture capitalists, cable operators, real estate people, you name it. The meaning of a porn industry is that it now has a place at the table in corporate America. This is what gives it its power. People say to me, well, if you do anything against pornography, won't it go underground? And I say, maybe, but that's a much better place for it to be, because above ground gives it political and economic and cultural status. Right? So you need to begin to think about the fact that every time a man buys pornography, the banks and credit card companies are making money. You need to now begin to think about how most of these mainstream companies have an economic interest in the porn industry. That changes everything. Right? We're not talking about a few men or the mafia or guys in dirty raincoats. We are talking, what I like to call them, are pimps in designer suits with MBAs. That's what a pornographer is. He's a pimp in a designer suit with an MBA, usually from one of the top universities. So we are now exploring how the industry functions as an industry, much like we would the auto industry. Now, industries develop what's called dominant design. New industries mature, and when they mature, they eventually coalesce around a product. Now, let's talk about the two major products in the porn industry. Nobody anymore talks about softcore or hardcore pornography when you interview the pornographers. Why? Because most of softcore pornography has migrated to pop culture. It doesn't exist anymore. When you interview pornographers, the business terms they use are either features or gonzo. And I'm going to explain what each one is. Now, a feature is mainly the Wicked studio or the Vivid studio. And this is a film that has an attempt to mimic a Hollywood movie. So it's longer, it's got some music, it's got some storyline, but all in the service of delivering hardcore sex. The industry says that men alone do not watch features. The role of the feature is to show it to a girlfriend often to groom her into porn sex. In my interviews, for example, when I interviewed one guy, he explained how he wanted his girlfriend to have anal sex, but he didn't know how to introduce it. So he used feature porn. And he watched her very carefully to see how she responded. And as she responded in certain ways, then he knew to then bring in anal sex into their relationship. So it's a groomer. What the porn industry says, what my studies show, and what all studies show, is that when men are alone, they don't watch feature. They watch gonzo. The father of gonzo is a man called Max Hardcore. And he writes on his site, "I force girls to drink my piss, fist fuck them, ream their asses, and drill their throats until they puke." Now let me tell you about Max Hardcore. When I wrote my first book in 1995, I came across him. It was watching a psychopath at work. I remember almost dissociating from watching his movies. And I'd watched a whole weekend of porn, and this man just sent me over the edge. When I started interviewing pornographers in the 90s about Max Hardcore, not one of them would speak to me about him. As far as they were concerned, he was untouchable. The other end, no one wanted anything to do with him. Today, he is front and center. When I went to Las Vegas 2 years ago to the big porn convention, so imagine this, every January, 10,000 fans and me descend on Las Vegas to go to these conventions, okay? When you go into the porn convention, which is a football field, the site huge, with pornography, hardcore pornography everywhere, and I open my book with the story of what it's like there, bang smack in the middle, with the biggest booth and the longest lines, is Max Hardcore, right? He's now front and center. That is empirical evidence of the shift from the 90s to present day, is the way the industry has embraced Max Hardcore. So what I'm going to do is explain what goes on in gonzo pornography. Now, first of all, in gonzo pornography, what you notice is there's no such thing as women. There's cunts, whores, cum dumpsters, butt tubes. Very, very important. What pornography has to do is destroy the humanity of the woman. Because the man masturbating to the image cannot, under any circumstances, look at her as a human being. Because if he does, it's all over. He will see her for what's going on, the pain, the humiliation, the degradation. The Nazis did this to the Jews and turned them into kikes. Racists did this to blacks with niggers. Homophobes do this to homosexuals with the word fags. What you do is you take a group and you strip it of its humanity, and they become different to you. This is what porn does to women. She's not a woman, she's a cunt, she's different. Now, what I wanted to show you now, and I'm going to take you through, is I want you to understand. What I do is I follow a 12-year-old boy on the internet. I put porn into Google, and I go where he goes with no credit card. So every image and every discussion I'm about to have now is mainstream pornography. If you are thinking of pornography, of people making love, I, who have researched this for 20 years, would not know where to find that on the internet. It's not there. You have to have a special niche market, and I don't know where to go. All I do is put porn into Google, you get into a porn hub, and I just click, 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 and I'm going to show you what I come up with 2 to 3 clicks. If I come up with it in 15 seconds, then a 12-year-old boy comes up with it in 10 seconds, okay? So, the first gonzo sex act, and gonzo, again, is the shorthand term the industry uses for the hardcore porn, is gagging. Gagging a woman with a penis till she chokes, as in ghetto gaggers or gag on my cock. Now, What they do, and this is again, you will not see a film on the internet through Google that does not have this. The penis goes so far down the throat that she is gagging. The tears are streaming down her face. And as she's gagging, he's got his hand behind her head and he's pulling her towards his penis and he's saying, look at me, look at me. And the camera looks down, she's gagging, saliva, sometimes vomit and tears. They put a lot of mascara on her so you get visual depiction of her tears. Standard image. Sometimes they hold her nose so she really can't breathe. So gagging is every single gonzo movie, virtually. I have not come across one that does not have it. Let me read you what they say on the site Gag Me and Then Fuck Me. Do you know what we say to things like romance and foreplay? We say fuck off. This is not another site with half-erect weenies trying to impress bold sluts. We take gorgeous young bitches, remember, term bitches, and do what every man would really like to do. We make them gag till their makeup starts running, and then they get all of the holes sore. Vaginal, anal, double penetration. Double penetration is 2 penises in the vagina, 2 in the anus. Anything brutal involving a cock and an orifice. And then we give them a sticky bath, which means they ejaculate all over them. Now I want you to think of something. When I read this, I thought of my son, who's now in his 20s. And I thought, what would have happened if my boy would have put porn into Google at 12? What would he be looking for? Breasts, maybe? Naked women? Do you think he's looking for gag me and then fuck me? And then I'm thinking, imagine, though, you get into that and the trauma, because I want you to think about boys being traumatized now by the porn industry. And notice how they pull them in. What they say is we take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. This is very clever, because that would be saying to my 12-year-old and your 12-year-old is, are you man enough for this? Because we know what you want. You might not know it yet, but we are telling you that if you are a real man, this is what you want. And you tell me what 12-year-old can take that challenge and say, no, I'm not a real man. The pornographers are brilliant at this because they want to get the kids. And they understand boys do not want gag me and then fuck me. So what they are in the business of doing is constructing a young male sexual identity that is consistent with gonzo. Does this make sense? Because a 12-year-old boy, I am sure, is not looking for this. Okay, so now what you're in the business of doing, like all industries, is you're getting them young. Just as the alcohol industry and the cigarette industry gets them young, this is what they're doing. The other standard gonzo is very, very rough anal sex. Image after image. And I want to read you a promotional copy from the movie Anally Ripped Whores. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want, and we're giving it to you. Chicks being ass-fucked till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done. This is the promotional copy, okay? So it's very clear, no pretense, no we're making love, we're having erotic sex. These whores are going to be anally ripped. And this is gonzo porn. This is standard mainstream porn. Standard porn image, film, 1 woman, 3 men. Oral, anal, vaginal, pounding away. As they are pounding away, they are pulling her hair, they're spitting in her mouth, and they're calling her a bitch and a whore and a cunt. And then the scene afterwards is ejaculation all over. They all ejaculate at the same time. You know how many times I give this lecture across the United States of America in colleges, and women come up to me and say, oh my God, he's been wanting to ejaculate on me, and I don't understand where it comes from. I had no idea. And then they find out. This is what happens to often women when I go and give lectures, young women, is they suddenly realize where all of these sex acts that he's been pushing her into are coming from. The latest one that is very big is ATM, ass to mouth. This is where the penis goes into the anus and then straight into the mouth without washing. Now, this is a perfect example of what pornography is. The more she is degraded, the better the sex. because there is no heightened arousal from ATM as to mouth outside of her degradation. This is what it's all about. So we need to start thinking about pornography as about degradation and not sex. Gonzo is that the sex is sizzles because she's degraded, debased, dehumanized. Now I want to tell you some of the results of what happens to these women. When I wrote my book, what I didn't expect was all these emails I got from people who work in the porn industry to tell me the truth of the porn industry. And I got an email from a few people who work in the testing of women, okay? So first of all, you have to understand there's no condoms on the set. So the major form of sex education for Icelandic boys is sex with no condoms. It's ATM, it's anal, and it's choking. So this is what Icelandic boys are being socialized in thanks to their viewing of American porn. So this is a list from Adult Industry Medical Healthcare Association, which has since been closed, but it is the industry volunteer body that did the testing. So a few people who do the testing, this is what somebody told me. So they've done the testing, throat swabs, anal swabs, vaginal swabs. And then someone comes into the room and knocks on his door and says, "We've mislabeled all the tests." And he says, "What do you mean?" So she said, "I've just checked the throat swabs, and there's fecal infections in the throat swabs. They must be the anal swabs." Turns out it wasn't. Women are getting fecal infections in their throat because of ATM. Now, I went to give blood a few months ago in America, and in the lab are all big signs. If you have come into contact with any body fluids, call 1-800 24 hours a day, right? Call this number. And I'm thinking, could you imagine putting that on a porn set? If you come into contact with any body fluids, call this number, right? Because you are swimming in semen, you're swimming in blood, you're swimming in vomit, all of those things are around you. Urine, this, and nobody gives a damn for these women. And the question would be as well, is that would you in Iceland import a product that had proudly written on it, made with children's slaves, or made in conditions that are unbearable for the average human being? You wouldn't, would you? But yet, you import pornography that is made in conditions where no other group, apart from prostituted women, have to live in. This is the reality of women in pornography. This is their life. The average woman in pornography lasts 3 months. The biggest single problem are anal prolapses. Their anuses drop out and have to be repeatedly sewn back into the body because of the rough anal sex. Now, one of the things that people say, well, isn't free porn destroying the porn industry? The answer to that is no. It is actually reshaping and redefining the business model. What free porn is doing is making a few people very rich, and it is helping to drive young boys into porn. Because who typically goes to free porn? Kids without a credit card. Now, free porn is actually owned by the porn industry. I'm going to talk about this. Now, when I say, who are the big pornographers? Do people think of Hugh Hefner or maybe Larry Flint? Forget it. Him. Anyone heard of him? Fabian Thyman? This guy lives under the radar. He is probably the single biggest porn magnate in the world. He's a German industrialist who lives in Luxembourg, which is where the company is. He owns a company called Manwin. It is the Walmart of pornography. Manwin owns a huge amount of paid sites, and it owns the free porn sites. And it uploads its paid porn onto its free porn sites as a way to bring in a younger group. And then it does this thing called monetize. And how does it monetize free porn into paid porn? It drives traffic to its own porn sites, often using teasers. Their studies found that 3 to 5 minute uploaded images on free porn sites is just enough to get the guy aroused, but not enough to ejaculate. So then he'll go into paid porn to finish the job. They also get percentages from sites for converters. That is, everyone who goes into a free porn site and ends up in one of the ads for a paid porn site, the free porn site gets paid. They use banner ads for penis enlargers, and they use ads for webcams. These are when women pop up and say, do you want a private porn show? Webcams are huge now because it stops piracy. And they also sell the emails to spammers. Free porn is probably going to save the paid porn in the long run. What free porn is doing is putting the small pornographers out of business. For example, in 1 year, Manwin, which is Fabian Thyman's business, pre-tax earnings increased more than 40%. It is reported that Thyman has recently spent $140 million to purchase new websites. He employs over 500 people in 5 different countries. This is the state of the industry today. This is an article from Adult Video News, which is the porn manual, the trade manual of the porn industry. This is an article by a man called Jack Morrison. And it's an article that's thrilled because it says it turns out that 1 in 4 men at any one time on a porn site is considered a porn addict. So the industry is saying 1/4 of any men at any one time on a porn site fits an addict. And what this article is about, it is about how to produce software to keep the addict more addicted. And they're explaining how you do this. So this is the level of research they're doing. Finding out what percentage are adults and then developing addicts and then developing software to keep them addicted. Now, what's the future of all of this? Where's it going? This is an interview with a man called Jules Jordan, who is a really hardcore gonzo director. And he said in an interview, one of the things about today's porn and the extreme market, the gonzo market, is so many fans want to see so much more extreme stuff that I'm always trying to figure out ways to do something different. So this is the problem. The porn industry has exploded to such a degree, with so many boys and men on it, that there's now a built-in desensitization and boredom. They want more. But the porn industry is a legal business. And they have done virtually everything they can do to the woman's body without killing her. So they're up against a mess. They're in a mess. They're up against a wall. They really don't know what to do. How much further can they take this and stay within the law? Because trust me, these guys want to stay within the law. The last thing they want are the FBI coming after them. So now the question is, where is it all going to go? And I have to tell you, I don't know. I really don't know. Because if they are bored with choking and ripping out her anus and all the torture that they do on the sites that I see, where is it going to end? And they feel the same way. So let me just give you a few clues of where it's going. In 2003, the Free Speech Coalition, which is the lobbying arm of the American porn industry, went to the Supreme Court and they argued that the 1997 Child Pornography Act was too limiting. The 1997 Act said very clearly, you cannot use anyone under 18 or anyone who looks under 18. The Free Speech Coalition, which is the lobbying arm of the porn industry, said very clearly, this is too limiting for our free speech. We want to use girls who look under 18. The Ashcroft Supreme Court agreed. And overnight, you got an expansion in what looks like child porn, but is actually legal, because she's probably 18. So now this is one way it's going, because children are the new it. Edgy, different, transgressive. The porn user is always looking to push the envelope. One of the reasons you are seeing an explosion in child pornography is because of men who are not pedophiles getting into something different. Now, again, get your head around this. These are men who are often porn addicts. They get bored. This is what the guys told me in that Connecticut prison. They get into file sharing, right, where they swap thousands and thousands of images. And then they come across a child buried in those images. And they all said the same thing to me. They said, we looked at the children and said, no, 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 we're not going there. And then they started to think about it. And then a few days later, they hit on the child. And then, before they know it, they are downloading real child pornography. The average length of time in the men I interviewed, from the first time they viewed child pornography to raping a child, was 1 year. 1 year. These were non-pedophile men. never touched a child till their 40s. Again, anyone who knows pedophiles know by the age of 40, they've left hundreds of victims in their wake. So now we have expanded the realm of potential for violence, which is why it is absolutely nonsensical, makes no sense to separate child pornography from adult women pornography. It is the same industry. They work together. The pornographers know this, and they have a vested interest in everyone saying, no, we don't like child pornography, but this is normal adult pornography. It is not. Adult pornography is driving men to child pornography. Some men start with child pornography, some men end up with them. So we have sites like this, all legal, first time with daddy, daddy's whore, it's okay, she's my stepdaughter. This is all perfectly legal thanks to the Ashcroft Supreme Court. Now the question is, well, free speech. The pornographers said this is free speech. Let me ask you. First of all, it is not free speech, it is corporate speech. Let's separate free speech from corporate speech. Very, very different, okay? What you and me have is speech. What they have is corporate speech, which costs money. Secondly, I would like to know if you think the corporate speech of a small group of pornographers in America is more important than the safety of Icelandic women and children. Do you think those men who live in Los Angeles, that handful, have more rights to their speech than you and your children have from freedom from fear of violence? Do their rights to free speech trump yours? And again, it's not free speech, it's corporate speech. So these are questions to think about when people start arguing free speech. You know what? A civilized society is always about balancing harms. That's what you do. You balance harms. And as far as I'm concerned, the well-being and safety of women and children far outbalance the corporate speech rights of these corporate predators. So what can we do? You can buy my book. Right? I want to tell you about capitalism. I get 80 cents for every book, okay? That's capitalism. So let's think about how we can move on. This is from Maxim. And this is a men's magazine that says this is how you cure a feminist. And you start over there and you end over there. And our job in the feminist movement is to start there and end there without the cigarette, okay? Now, the only answer to the porn industry is feminist movement. That does not mean it's only women here. We welcome pro-feminist men. Absolutely welcome. In fact, as I say to men before, we are your best friends and your only hope at some humanity, not the pornographers. But the answer to this has to be based in gender equality. It is not a moral issue, it is not a religious issue, it is a harms issue, and it is our right to freedom from fear and our right to bring our children up in a society that is safe and life-loving. You all have a vested interest in each other's children. Right? In America, we don't have that. It's all individualism. You here have a collective understanding that what you do affects what you do, what you do. You have done amazing things. You have criminalized the Johns, okay? Incredible. You have closed down strip clubs. I mean, any country that can do this, as far as I'm concerned, can put pornography in their sites as well, right? I was on a radio show, and it was in Canada, and we had this great interview, and the guy said to me at the end, he said to me, Gail Dines, aren't you pushing a boulder up a hill? And I said, yes, of course I'm pushing a boulder up a hill. But that's what you do to make the world livable. You push boulders up hills. The labour movement pushed a boulder uphill so workers would have decent lives. The civil rights movement pushed a boulder up a hill so that people of colour would have decent lives. The feminist movement pushes a boulder up a hill so that women and children and everyone else can have a decent life. That's what you do to make life worth living. You push boulders up hills. Let me tell you, it is going to take one country with the guts and the political will and the courage to take these fuckers on. One country to say enough. You have no right to come in here and hijack our sexuality. You have no right to turn our boys and girls into victims. We want our sexuality. It belongs to us. When my son was 12, I said to him, you know what I said? I can't follow you around all your life. And if you're going to look at pornography, I can't tell you what to do, but I want you to think about something. You have a choice first on whether to look or not. And then I said, before you make this choice, think of something. Think of the fact that we do not know if you are gay, if you are straight, if you are bi. Your sexuality is developing. You don't know what it looks like yet, but it will grow into something authentic that is meaningful to you and who you are in this world. But if you look at pornography, they will steal it from you before it's even yours. And that is a terrible thing to steal, because you have a right to an authentic sexuality. And recently, he's now in his 20s, I said to him, well, you know, what about pornography? And he said, well, Mum, you pretty much ruined that one for me. Which was exactly what I wanted. So let me say, I did not want my son to be hijacked by the pornographers. I wanted him to live a life where he could be the author of his own sexuality. And it's not just about sex. Pornography is a message about the world you want to live in, about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a father, a mother, the kind of world you want to shape. And I want to say to you, who gave Americans the right to be cultural imperialists and to go all over the world and to dictate the sexuality of people all over the world? Now, when I go and lecture anywhere and people say, what can we do? I leave them with a list of things. I am not going to leave you with a list of things. You know better than me what you can do. You did it against prostitution. You did it against strip clubs. It is now time to take the pornographers on. If you can do it against the others, you can do it against this, and you can be an absolute beacon to the world to show what courage looks like. Thank you. Sit down. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.